Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to our corporate sponsorship webinar series hosted by Cosmo Sports and Entertainment. My name is Evan Colborn. I'm the Director of Business Development here with Cosmo Sports and Entertainment. And here with me is Carrie Kaplan, our President and founder of Cosmo Sports and Entertainment. So this is episode 10 of our corporate sponsorship webinar series, and it's brought to you by Central Counties Tourism and Sport Durham. So a very special thanks to both those groups for putting on this webinar series and for allowing us to host it. If this is your first time joining us, just a few housekeeping items before we get started. So if you have any trouble seeing the slides behind us on the screen, all the slides will be provided afterwards. So don't worry if you can't quite make something out on the screen. If you have any questions, if you're watching on the YouTube broadcast, you can submit those through the live chat, which is in the top right corner of the screen. If you're in the full screen mode, you may need to exit out of that to submit questions through there. And you also have to have a Google account and must be signed in order to submit questions through there. If one of those is not the case for you, please feel free to submit questions through our email. You can find our emails at cosmosports.com, and on the team page, you can find all of our emails there, or you can send it to info@cosmosports.com. If you're submitting questions through the live chat, please do so as throughout the broadcast. There is about a 10-second delay on the stream. So if you submit a question right at the end, we may not actually see it on our end before we wrap up the broadcast here. So submit questions as you go, and we'll try to get to all those questions in the last couple of minutes of the stream. So as I mentioned, this is episode 10 of our series. We spent the first 8 episodes going through the entire sponsorship process from start to finish, looking at everything from what sponsors want, what types of inventory we have, how to value that inventory, who to reach out to for sponsorship, how to negotiate, how to measure it. And we spent our 9th episode looking at digital sponsorship, which is a kind of emerging trend for a lot of organizations and properties. But this episode, we wanted to really focus on naming rights and really the marquee inventory that properties and organizations have. And the reason being that, it really seems like naming rights, or at least maybe the mindset about naming rights and the comfort of selling naming rights is a lot more prevalent nowadays. Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, I think it's interesting. I think it's a good final topic here for this seminar, because I think naming rights is a very new phenomenon relative to sponsorship. So you think in Toronto, the Blue Jays played at Exhibition Stadium. When I grew up, Blue Jays played at Exhibition Stadium. The Leafs played at Maple Leaf Gardens, and more recently, or I guess 20 years ago, the Blue Jays that played the Skydome. None were named, and these are high-profile teams. Imagine the Toronto Maple Leafs in a facility that wasn't named. So it's a very recent and couple of decades old phenomenon as far as naming rights, both of events, facilities, and events. So I think it's emerging, and I think that's I think that's why and why I think that is. I think it's a great opportunity for organizations, and I know we're talking to a number of municipalities and nonprofits that are still oftentimes behind the curve and are maybe reluctant to name a building for somebody who's not an individual, but reluctant to name it for TD Bank or Home Depot. And I think that for those who are reluctant, it's a real missed opportunity.
Right. So from the property side, makes a lot of sense. As we'll get into, pretty significant revenue driver, revenue opportunity for properties. For sponsors, though, it maybe we're seeing it more often, that this desire to seek out opportunities for naming rights. Why do you think it's maybe of interest to them more now?
Well, I think so. Practical example: we're sitting here in mid 2018, and we're based in Mississauga, and the 2 facilities closest to us were both just renamed. There's Paramount Center, which is so people may not know, the Hershey Center is now going to be Paramount, I think, Center, and Powerade Center is CAA Center. And both there's 2 examples of 2 companies with very different interests. Paramount is a growing restaurant chain that wants their footprint to be stronger. They're going to have food options in the facility, so they have a direct benefit, but also it's a really big opportunity for them to brand themselves. They're a new company themselves. I think they're not more than 20 years old. You take that compared to CAA, there's a company that I think is 100 plus years old, or 100 years old, and they've been in all, you think of them as automotive, but they've been in insurance and travel and all kinds of things. So, and they see the value, not the name because everybody knows CAA. So you think, oh, why would they want naming? But they're also thinking that it's activation. It's maybe some of their other brands. It's cars driving by the facility and people haven't renewed their membership. And so you can see two very different companies that are spending north of $1 million over a period of time because they really see value. So I think it's an example. Each company has different motivations, but they're game-changing decisions. Those are big. Those names are going to be said tens of thousands of times, and that's different from a traditional sponsorship.
Right. So with that understanding, it's a lot more common now, a lot more, people's mindset, a lot more open to naming rights, and companies are seeing the value in it. Big opportunity for properties. So what we're going to focus on today is really first is, talking about just some examples of this rise of naming rights and how much more common it is now. We'll also talk about the value of naming rights and from both sides, where sponsors see the value in it, where properties can really see the value in naming rights, what factors really drive that value through naming rights partnerships. And then we'll take a look at some of the companies who are more likely to purchase naming rights through some examples that we'll show. So before we get started, we do normally like to talk about just a definition, so everybody's kind of on the same page of what we're talking about here. So naming rights, really, it's an advertising, it's a sponsorship agreement where a company agrees to purchase the name of the event or the facility or something like that, and they usually will replace the traditional name with their corporate name. So the example here being, the Rogers Cup. It's a ATP tennis event in Toronto. It's the Rogers Cup or the Rogers Center. So those are kind of examples of naming rights. But you can also look at it as on a couple different levels. So there's, title sponsorship, which is really that example of, Rogers Cup. They're titling the event or they're titling the facility. And then there's presenting sponsor, which kind of gets included in kind of the naming rights moniker is in presenting sponsorship. And that you can see in the example here on the screen is the presented by National Bank. So that's kind of a presenting sponsor. Right. Tends to be a still very high level marquee sponsor for a property, but just slightly different from maybe the title sponsorship. And then you get some cases like the Rogers Cup where you actually have a title sponsor, Rogers Cup, and you've got a presenting sponsor, National Bank. Now, those are probably a little bit more rare. But I guess for people kind of listening on the stream here, when should people be thinking about a title sponsor versus a presenting sponsor? Are there different cases where one's more appropriate than the other?
I don't know if there's one's more appropriate than the other. I think sometimes where people are reluctant is you have and it's not really the case here exactly, but you have a case where there's a historic name tied to something. So you have the John Smith tournament, and you don't want to remove John Smith's name from the tournament. You could say the John Smith tournament presented by National Bank. So that allows you to still maintain the integrity of the name or the institution, but also still have a corporate partner that gets a lot of leverage. So I think that's more common. I think what Tennis Canada did was creative in that they've got two, in essence, major partners that are attached to it. What you'll see arenas or facilities where, like CAA Center is the building, but RBC in the past has named one of the rinks inside the building. So you could play at the RBC rink in the CAA Center.
Right.
So that, there's concepts like that as well.
Yeah. We've seen that too with, the city of Kitchener. The box office was named, certain lounges and areas being named. And for a lot of people that might be listening, might be representing municipalities and things where that legacy naming rights is very common, where, community center was named after a real prominent citizen or something like that. May initially think, we're kind of blocked out from naming rights, but with the presenting sponsor concept, maybe not, and you can still keep that legacy there.
Right.
So great. So a couple examples of some recent naming rights in the news. Quite recently, in the past couple of weeks, the facility in Sault Ste. Marie has been renamed the GFL Memorial Gardens. It was the SR Center before. One that probably just about everybody that's listening has heard about at some point over the last few months is Scotiabank agreeing to purchase the naming rights for what is now the ACC or the Air Canada Center. That one being a record-setting naming rights is it $40 million a year for 20 years. So a really prominent naming rights there. And we're going to touch on that one in particular a little bit more. You mentioned, the Powerade Center, going to be renamed the CAA Center. Mississauga is going to be renamed the Paramount Fine Food Center. So a lot of ones that have kind of recently kind of closed and will be changing names. And it really does kind of seem like every week there's more stories in the news about different naming rights opportunities that are becoming available. So, these are just a couple of headlines pulled from the last couple of weeks where you can see it's not just major sporting venues, but convention centers and community centers and soccer centers and theaters and all sorts of different things where, organizations that own these facilities are really looking at that and then saying, is this an opportunity for us? And even, we talked about the Rogers Center. Since the Scotiabank naming rights, you've even heard talk of the Blue Jays and Rogers considering selling the naming rights to Rogers Center, even though the team is owned by Rogers and the building's owned by Rogers. Right. Have to think that's because, just down the block, you see somebody getting $800 million for their naming rights. So begs the question, what could we get for the Rogers Center? But so very common anyways that, we're seeing a lot of stories, a lot of interest in naming rights, which can kind of make it seem like it's all positive. Things are going well. A lot of names a lot of companies are getting these really marquee assets and it's a new source of revenue for a lot of places. We did want to kind of highlight a couple, blunders or mistakes that have happened kind of over the years. So an example, the first one there being Enron Field with the Houston Astros. So they found their naming rights partner in Enron, and it wasn't too long after that their whole scandal came out, and the Houston Astros were stuck with the name plastered all over their facility. They were able to change it pretty quickly to Minute Maid Park, but that's an example. American Airlines, I believe this is back in 2011 for the NBA Finals. They had the Miami Heat playing in the American Airlines Center and the Dallas Mavericks playing in American Airlines Arena, both playing in the NBA Finals. Great opportunity for American Airlines, but company shortly after they're declared for bankruptcy. Third example, where the Oscars were held or still are kind of held for many years at the Kodak Theater in Hollywood, and Kodak going out of business, and kind of have to look back on that expense and say, was $75 million for naming rights a good business decision if shortly thereafter we went out of business? So we share these really just to kind of show that, it's on both, in the case of the Houston Astros, that is going to reflect poorly on the team. In the case of American Airlines, Kodak, maybe naming rights wasn't the right investment for them where their businesses were at that time, but it's a really big decision on both sides, right? It can, both sides really need to weigh, is this the right opportunity for us at this time? So with that, we wanted to kind of touch on some pros and cons. On the one hand, on the pro side, you can see with the cartoon here, a lot of assets being named recently, and it can be hard as if you're a property and looking for new sources of revenue, it can be really hard to pass up that opportunity if there's real interest for the naming rights. On the con side, this is where a lot of people kind of think this is where naming rights will lead us to, is where you go so far that, an example here where, you end up naming a fountain the Procter & Gamble Febreze fountain. And maybe that's, going a little bit too far, not really in the spirit of it. But I guess there's pros and cons to it, right?
Yeah, I think there is. And I think, but I would say, the con in that picture, it's a fun analogy there. What I would say is that most people probably listening to this webinar are overly concerned about the con, whereas we're a far ways away from that. In other words, I think, sure, you want your partners to be correct fits in naming rights, and ideally you don't want to be in a position where you take the first check that comes in the door or the first payment that comes in the door and you have a correct partner. But again, I think, people were elected. Again, Skydome, and people would always say, "Oh, I'm going to call it the Skydome forever." Well, there's still some people that call it the Skydome. But most people call it Rogers Center, and the branding has had an effect. It's there visually. People know it as that. So even though there was an initial hesitation there, which ironically, when BMO Field was announced, because there was no history, it didn't have a previous name, there was no backlash because you were changing the name. It's funny how people, so I think the general situation is people are very tolerant to that. Conceptually, people say, oh, I don't advertise on jerseys and don't do signage and don't do naming rights. It's just another one of those pieces that I think people are comfortable, and hopefully you can get a company that not only just sees really good value in being there. So I agree. There's you can go too far, but I think we're closer to the not going far enough at this point.
Right. And like you kind of alluded to, I mean, there's a time we're seeing it now where teams are selling more ads on the jerseys at the major league level, with the NBA doing it now. Not sure if other leagues will kind of follow suit. I know you've kind of told me stories of, there was times when on the outfield wall in baseball, I always thought of can't put signs on the outfield wall in baseball. So it's just that, that evolution over time, right?
Coca-Cola was the first. It's a funny story. Coca-Cola was the first when they had a big Coke bottle in the outfield of Fenway Park. It was the first, and it wasn't even exactly signage. The argument was it wasn't a sign. It was actually a Coke bottle behind the outfield. And there was huge debate. Major League Baseball battled, arguing, saying you can't do it. You don't have to go that far back to look at Major League Baseball where there's no signage. Say it'll distract players. It's just not, it's an American pastime, all these type of things. And I remember when Coke was the first sponsor there, people were saying how controversial it is. Now you look at Fenway Park and there's 20 different companies with signs throughout the field. So again, I think people tend to be change averse, and I think it's just another step in. Is it really a difference if a building is called Elm Street Building or it's called TD Place? And if it helps the city or the university or whatever it would be, I mean, what's the it's hard to understand what you'd really be losing.
So a couple kind of some other pros and cons. Obviously, on the pro side, I think the biggest one that weighs on everybody's mind is that this is a significant source of revenue for us, or could be. So that's got to be in the pro. A lot of cases, we did share a couple negative examples of some negative brand association with naming rights partners, but there could be a lot of positive brand association that could come with it if it's a really a brand that is really viewed positively by the community. Then it could really help. And some other marketing support. That if that company is investing that significantly in the naming rights, they have a vested interest in the facility being used and in having a lot of foot traffic coming through for events. So there might be some more in that kind of partnership sense, might be some support there.
And one of the best, again, I mentioned the BMO Field when they did BMO sponsored BMO Field. I think that was a great example of, they put their name on the field, they put their name on the jerseys of TFC in the first ever game at BMO, and it's famous because it's a controversy because everybody threw their seat cushions back on the field, but they were BMO seat cushions, and they did things to enhance that brand when it started. It gave TFC instant credibility. They had a soccer field, and you had one company that said, look, we're going to step up in a huge way. And, I don't know how many years TFC's been now, but 2 decades or whatever the time's been. BMO has an association with soccer throughout Canada. And I think it started there where they really took a foothold. And, I think, so to your point there about marketing support and brand association, I think that's an example. Banks tend to have not a great reputation. I think the BMO relationship with TFC only helped. I don't think there was anything in that hurt them. You can get credit cards with TFC players on it and logos. I think they would tell you that's been a wonderful experience, and also whatever they spent. So this would be the other thing I would say back to people. Whatever BMO has spent in all the years, I would think BMO would tell you that the investment's been great. So, and that's where, I think coming to Scotiabank, or we talked about Scotiabank there, I think the mistake people make often is think that Scotiabank overpaid. I don't believe it. I think that the value of these type of partnerships is significant. I mean, you have to make sure it works for you, but I'm really a believer in the value and it kind of building over time. I think the value of naming rights is only going to go higher over time as as opposed to low.
So looking at the con side, we showed a couple of those examples. The Enron field is an example. Some negative brand association is possible there. That perception of selling out. So if you're selling the name of the fountain, that example, that could be a bit of a con. And then the opportunity cost is another one that has to be weighed for a property that, in some cases, you may be able to generate 3 or 4 sponsorships from a particular category, for example. And if you're typically with the naming rights partner, common benefit that comes with that is exclusivity. So you may actually block yourself out of a category. So does that present an opportunity cost for other things?
It can. I think one interesting one, again, the timing we're doing this is marijuana is in the process of being legalized. So, it's a really interesting field. There's going to be companies, and some large companies are in that space, Pfizer and some companies that are heavily invested in that industry. Would facilities decide, is it like cigarettes where you say, well, we never touched that? Or is it like alcohol where, Labatt and Molson, Sleeman and all kinds of companies have had naming rights for years. So I think that presents an interesting situation, both in sponsorship and naming rights, to say, is this an industry that upside or downside? Which way do you go if a company that, I just heard recently, Second Cup, pretty solid brand, and they're going to be having, I don't know if it's marijuana products or they're going to have some things there. So, if Second Cup called you and said, we want to be a sponsor, is there any negative, positive, neutral connotation? So I think what's interesting is, to your point there, you got to weigh all the different things and make a decision on what fits.
Right. Right. So for properties, they may come to that conclusion that either it's not worth the risks, or it's a really big opportunity. We want to capitalize on it. Part of selling it, obviously, is understanding what the value is of it and why a potential sponsor would have any interest in naming rights. So we talk about these kind of 3 concepts of share of mind, share of heart, and share of market is really kind of buckets you can kind of put the value of a naming rights partnership into for a sponsor. Now, these examples are taken from an article by the CBC about the Scotiabank deal, and just pulled out some lines that really kind of provide some insight into why Scotiabank would look at something like the naming rights to what will be Scotiabank Arena. Because, like you said, you hear $800 million, and that's a lot of money, and it is record-setting in terms of naming rights. So, and there's a lot of studies out there that will debunk and say that it's not worth the money, and you can't draw the line to direct ROI like you can with some other maybe advertising or marketing programs. So, but if you kind of look at it from this perspective, the share of mind, share of heart, share of market, you can kind of see where companies are seeing the value in it.
Yeah, and it's relative. I say if you have $2 on you, $1.50 is a lot of money. So, you can look at it and say, oh, 40 million, 800 million is a lot of money. Well, not necessarily to Scotiabank. If you're making billions and billions of dollars on a regular basis, well, who says it's a lot of money? It might be a great investment for what you get to have your name on the premier hockey facility, arguably in the world. And you want to be the hockey bank, Share Heart says. So you say you want to be the hockey bank. What's the number one thing we can do to be the hockey bank? And then what's that worth? And is it worth, again, if it's worth 1% of your profit, then, the number can be overstated because most people are looking at it. We don't have $40 million in our bank account, or we can't relate to $40 million, but we don't own Scotiabank. Yeah. So I think it's, people generally really struggle with that, with understanding dollars. They tend to want to put themselves in those situations, which doesn't make a lot of sense. You have to try and put yourself in not even in the position of the employee at Scotiabank, but the company itself. It's the company's funds. And is it a good investment for the person sitting there with X billion dollars? And again, I would argue that, as you say here, that it's an ability to achieve their goals in all 3 areas for Scotiabank.
Yeah. So the examples being, share of mind really being, that awareness concept. People are aware of your business and connections to, in this case, hockey. So the line from the article, the reach of a hockey sponsorship portfolio in Canada is significant. So that at some point, the decision makers at Scotiabank in sponsorship decided that we want to market through hockey, because that is going to have such significant and deep reach into the Canadian communities, and that's going to be our way to achieve that strong share of mind. The second one, share of heart, and that's really appealing to the emotion of consumers. And the line from the article there, they've declared themselves as Canada's hockey bank. So again, a very conscious decision to tie themselves to hockey, something that a lot of people would consider very strong part of Canadian culture. So if Scotiabank can really position themselves as Canada's hockey bank, then all those people that really consider themselves deeply passionate about hockey might just have a better feeling about Scotiabank,
right?
Because of that.
Right. And if you're Canada's hockey bank, can Toronto Maple Leafs really play out of the CIBC Center? It's a problem. It's hard to reconcile those two cases. So I think that's where and banks the banks in Canada, yeah, it's pretty in part because they're very profitable. They're really sophisticated with this stuff. They really do a good job. CIBC, if anybody goes to Pearson Airport, CIBC's done an amazing job of, it's not exactly naming, but it's close to it. They have CIBC branches. They've named all the carts. You could argue that. So I guess what I'm saying there is that just an example, Scotiabank's an example. The banks are sort of leaders in understanding the naming rights type of concept, and they're not as we all know from service charges and fees, and they're not going to throw their money around without understanding.
So both of those, you could still, if it was just based on that, you could still kind of argue, okay, greater awareness. Maybe you can argue the emotional connection to the bank, but does that really drive an ROI on an $800 million investment? But the last point, share of market, and again another line taken from the CBC article, and this is quoted of one of the VPs of Scotiabank, who said, consumer research done for the bank that shows that people who are aware of its financial support for hockey are 3.5 times more likely to consider using its services. So there's kind of the numbers that they're looking for to say that this is really actually going to help our market share in Canada, right. But particularly within kind of the hockey market in Toronto. Right. So,
and just take that microcosm. The one example I'm going to give is a lot of, again, people are listening here. You're municipality related, or some of you guys, swimming pool. Most cities have swimming pools. Inside a facility, or are the pool areas or those swimming centers sponsored? And then if they're not, do you not think companies that make suntan lotion, or companies that make bathing suits, or companies that make towels would be interested? You don't think Speedo would be interested in having their name on the swimming pool? They'd be more interested in that potentially than anything else. And to your point here, if it was called Speedo swimming pool at Durham College, or there's going to be a propensity just like that 3.5 times that the people that are using that pool, seeing Speedo's advertisement and are going to have an affinity to that situation. And that's where Nike and Under Armour and Reebok and companies like that are very good. But again, this is something new. This is not, that's an example of something that's not traditional. But why can't you sponsor your athletic center, or your, as you said, box office, or your swimming pool, or your squash courts, or why not? There's no reason not to. And I think what's exciting too is there's companies that would be interested in that. So don't second guess yourself. There's companies that be interested. And usually the reluctance, interesting enough, comes more from the property than it does from the sponsor. And it's not part of defined inventory, and it's not there. It's not an option.
So shifting it back to the property side, and as they're considering selling these naming rights, it's very common to kind of stop short on this list and really focus on a lot of the share of mind that a naming rights is going to really increase awareness and all that kind of stuff. But as a property, if you can really show how this is going to, yes, do that, but also how you're going to leverage the emotional appeal as well. And if you can actually get down into the weeds of it and show this is how we think it's going to impact your actual share of market, much easier to justify it because of the large expenditures on naming rights. It can get a lot easier to justify for that company that it's a worthwhile investment.
Yeah.
So some factors that kind of go into the value of naming rights. I mean, like you mentioned, it's different for every company. Every company is going to place a different value on a naming rights opportunity. Their potential ROI could be different based on what their lifetime customer value is and things like that. But there's lots of things that could influence the value of a particular naming rights opportunity. But a couple that we did want to spend just a couple minutes on. So the first one, the importance in the community. So that really being a influencing factor on the value. So if this is, in the case of, we were talking about what will be Scotiabank Arena and the importance of that building to the hockey community, arguably, I know, in Toronto, we like to think we are the center of the hockey universe, but, arguably a very important venue anyways for the hockey community, and then a very important venue for Canada and for Toronto in particular. So, a big factor in influencing its value in terms of a naming rights opportunity. Annual attendance, I mean, that seems like a pretty obvious one. That's going to influence the value of a naming rights. The potential for activation, I think, is one that can kind of sometimes go undervalued because, the thinking being, naming rights, a lot of it about awareness. And, when we think of naming rights, we think of that kind of marquee signage on the building or, the company's name as part of the event logo or things like that. But the ability to take it beyond just a branding and awareness piece and take it to the point where you can actually activate the brand even further, that can really drive the value.
Right. So a good example, using the same example, let's say Coppertone, it's Coppertone Pool. Well, that's fine. You can have a sign and you can have some branding and you can have some logo. But imagine if Coppertone 6 times a year, once a month, did something where they gave away samples and they had people there talking about the UV protection of Coppertone and why it's the best value, and they gave free samples to everybody who was there. You would think that a percentage of those people, not only that are at Coppertone Pool, not only that got free samples from Coppertone, but there's a propensity. There are people that probably like swimming or have some, involvement. A percentage of those people, the next time they go to buy lotion, probably going to buy Coppertone. So if you can look at that and say, okay, 10%, 20% of 1,000 people are converted to use our product, that's powerful. So that's where the activation comes in. That's a lot stronger than just putting your name there. And that's the onus is on the property. The onus is on you guys here to help the sponsor come up with that. I think a mistake, is going to a sponsor saying, what do you want? If it's your venue, you guys are the ones selling it. I think, the prompting and the discussion about opportunities that may be exciting for the company are, I think that if the property's doing that or the event or the facility, I think you're going to increase your chance that companies are going to come forward.
So the other one we wanted to just touch on here is term. So naming rights, term is a really important factor in naming rights. On the property side, you don't want to be in a situation where maybe you're changing the name of a venue every 3 years or every year or something like that. So term becomes really important for the property.
Yeah, but here's why it's so great from a revenue perspective. So again, I know I've used the example 3 times, but you stick with that Coppertone example. So somebody says, yeah, we'd like to put a sign up at your pool. And let's say that's $5,000, or let's say it's $1,000. I want to put their name up. And they put a sign up. Well, you say, well, do you guys want to keep it up for 3 years? We'd say, no, we'll try it for 6 months or a year or your summer season. So even if the naming rights is the same amount, even if it's $1,000 to name the facility, very unlikely Coppertone is going to want to put their name on the facility, and then it starts to get into social media and people start to call it the Coppertone pool for 1 year. So what happens is what would have been a $1,000 sponsor could be a $10,000 or $5,000 naming rights partner, because companies understand very well that if they are doing naming rights, there's going to be value, and you're paying for signage, and there's going to be value in longer term. So term's important, but again, one thing about today as opposed to some of the other seminars, naming rights is much easier to sell on a longer term than almost any other form of sponsorship.
Right. And if I'm the sponsor too, on the one hand, I may like the flexibility of short term, but on the other hand, like you said before, naming rights, the value of them is likely going to continue to go up. So a longer term actually gives me an opportunity to lock in a price over the course of the next 10 years or something. Maybe ends up saving me money in the long run.
It does, and it also takes people a while to start calling it the Coppertone pool. So say I'm going to the Ajax pool, and if you've been going to the Ajax pool for 5 years, and all of a sudden it's called the Coppertone pool, you're still going to probably call it the Ajax pool for a while. Eventually, in order to get that in your head and everybody else's head, it takes time. It might mean you have to go there 20 times. So it might be by the third year that you're finally calling it the Coppertone pool, and all of a sudden they they pull their name down. So again, the value for a company in doing this is in repeating over and over again. I mean, there's lots of studies on retail. Costco is the most, we've done some work with Costco, and Costco is the most notorious for very few people buy a new product their first time through Costco. So if you see something, hey, they've got a television there and it's great, or they're now selling golf shirts, something as simple as that. The first time you see them there, you might still buy your bread and milk and say, oh, they had some golf shirts. It might be the third or fourth time you come through there that you actually purchase a golf shirt at Costco. And I think it's the same thing here, that it's just the way our minds work, so to absorb that a name of a facility is with a company is going to take some time.
So just a couple, kind of typical assets that go along with naming rights. There's the obvious ones that I think everybody kind of associates directly with naming rights. So things like the Marquee signage. So a picture here of T-Mobile Arena, the new arena in Las Vegas, currently hosting the Stanley Cup final. But some dominant branding for T-Mobile there, both statically on the top of the building there, but then the massive LED board on the front there. So that's pretty common with naming rights. So regardless of the size of your event or facility or anything, that's one thing you do want to keep in mind is how are we going to ensure that our naming rights partner, that patron coming in is not just seeing sponsors kind of scattered evenly across, that they really get that feel that the naming rights partner has a dominant presence here. There's the logo, so custom logo for venues or events that includes and integrates the sponsor's name and mark into that logo. That's fairly common. Then there's all your other things, your directional signage, your web and digital. Exclusivity we talked about is a big, pretty standard that comes with most naming rights, is that there's going to be exclusivity for that category along with it. But all that stuff really is really kind of surface level. It's the tangible things that come along with the naming rights. But what they're really buying, and it's what you kind of just touched on there, is that it's the casual conversation between two people. Right. Where's the game tonight? It's at the Rogers Center. Right. Where are you going swimming? Going to Coppertone Pool. Like, that's really the asset that they're buying, is that the casual references between people. So wanted to kind of touch on who are the companies that are most interested and most commonly interested in naming rights opportunities. And we took a look at some of the OHL buildings and their naming rights partners, and it can serve as a pretty good example of who is most commonly interested in these types of opportunities. So if you look at the Meridian Center in St. Catharines, Sleeman Center in Guelph, the Budweiser Gardens in London, one thing that all those naming rights partners have in common is headquarters or a significant footprint in those communities. So one thing that we find is very very common amongst companies that are looking to do naming rights is that they have a strong local footprint, whether that's a significant number of employees or a significant number of customers that are in that area, some sort of significant local footprint. They also, this is a big play to get into a naming rights. So tends to be a company that's looking to be that dominant leader in their category for that market. They want to differentiate and distance themselves from their competition by showing that they're on a completely other level than their competition. And it's often more B2C. So companies that are looking to target consumers directly, they're more often going to be those naming rights partners with the, simply just because a significant amount of the value that's derived from naming rights is in that brand exposure and that awareness and that share of mind and all that kind of stuff. So tends to be more B2C companies. So as you're looking at your assets and, maybe considering naming rights and who to approach for naming rights, it's going to likely be one of those type of companies, somebody that's got a significant local presence, wants to be a dominant leader, more B2C than a B2B type of company. And that can help you kind of narrow your search a little bit for a naming rights partner. The other point I wanted to touch on here is just the length of the sales cycle for a naming rights. What have you found, anyways, that, how long it takes to really find a partner?
I mean, I think it's an interesting. I mean, we've done some situations that took long. We did worked on one that took almost 2 years. I think part of it is, pricing's tricky. What's the valuation of a facility? How hard or how long or how hard do you hold with a specific price? Finding the right fit. But there's some situations that are very quick. I think because it's a large asset, I think don't assume it's going to be sold overnight, but I would say you have to be proactive. If you're reactive, it's going to take a long time. People aren't going to necessarily come to you and say, we'd like to sponsor you or put our name on our soccer center. Again, the onus is with a lot of things, the onus is on the property to sell sponsorship as opposed to expecting people to walk in your door and buy it. Building a rate card and saying, here's how much it's worth and putting a press release out is not going to sell your name. So I think, again, some people get confused and think somehow that the job isn't complete until sales made. So creating inventory and decks and pricing and valuations is the beginning, it's not the end. And sometimes I think, again, with nonprofits and municipalities, there's this huge effort to create pricing and build inventory, and then a lack of interest or commitment to selling companies into that inventory.
Great. So our takeaways really for today, one, naming rights, big opportunity for properties, big opportunity for sponsors as well. So really, and we're seeing it much more often now. The mindset really has changed. People are much more comfortable with the idea now. So probably not going to go anywhere anytime soon.
Yep.
It's a big decision. So there are pros and cons to it. So you want to evaluate it carefully and make sure that you're considering all the potential pros and cons before entering into a long-term naming rights partnership with a particular company. And it's most likely going to be a significant local business. Local business means business that has a significant local presence in that community.
Yeah, that's what I said. So when you say a significant local business, it can be it's a business with roots. So Tim Hortons Field, Tim Hortons was founded in Hamilton. Tim Hortons is obviously a massive company across Canada. Now it's global. Tim Hortons Field is in Hamilton. So I think it can be, if you look at your city or your area and see companies that have a heritage or a presence or a lot of years there, or it's a foothold, I agree. Those are places to start anyway. Paramount, by the way, was one of those examples. Paramount was founded in Mississauga. I don't think they would have been comfortable naming if you would have called them from any other city, it's unlikely it would have happened. It was either we're going to do this in Mississauga or we're not going to do it at all. So to your point.
Great. So Ben, any questions in the chat? No? Great. So if anybody does have any questions, you can always reach us at info@cosmosports.com. If you go to cosmosports.com, you can find all of our direct emails there, and please feel free to submit any questions at any time there. We're happy to chat about sponsorship at any time. And with that wraps up our corporate sponsorship webinar series, all 10 episodes. So very special thanks to Central Counties Tourism and Sport Durham for putting on this webinar series and allowing us to host it. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we look forward to keeping in touch with everybody and talking sponsorship. So thanks very much.
Thank you.